The wind on the plains had a name for folks like Hannah Weston. It called them ghosts. She lived on the edge of Providence Creek, a town that had already buried her. 2 years ago, they'd put her husband Arthur in the ground. A month after that, her baby son, Samuel. The town offered their prayers, but their eyes offered only pity. And pity was just a polite word for judgment. So Hannah became a ghost. She worked her garden, chopped her wood, and patched her clothes until the patches themselves had patches. She was quiet, she was capable, and they hated her for it. They wanted a weeping widow they could feel sorry for. What they got was a woman with a spine made of iron and a silence that felt like an accusation. Her cabin sat right where the tamed land gave up and the wild began. And it was out there, in the wild, that her real story would begin. It started with a storm, a real screamer that tore across the plains all night. By morning, the world was scrubbed clean and shivering. Hannah went to check the snares she'd set by the creek, her boots sinking in the mud. And that's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a deer, washed up on the bank. A still, dark shape, half in the churning water. But as she got closer, the air froze in her lungs. It wasn't a deer. It was a man. His buckskin clothes were ripped, his black hair splayed in the muddy water like a dark fan. A dark stain was spreading across his side, and one of his legs was bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. He was a native man, a Lakota warrior by the look of him, and he was dying. Her first thought was pure, cold fear. This was the monster from Reverend Blackwood's Sunday sermons, the savage from the campfire stories, the reason men in this town kept rifles over their fireplaces. But then she saw his chest move, a tiny, ragged rise and fall. She looked past his torn clothes and the blood. His face was young, etched with pain, not hate. He was just a boy, really, no older than her Arthur had been. She looked back toward town. She could see the church spire, a sharp finger pointing at the sky, accusing her. She knew exactly what would happen if they found him. Sheriff Donovan would throw him in a cell to rot, or worse, the Reverend would whip up a mob, and they wouldn't even give him the mercy of a quick end. They would see a savage, a threat, an animal. But Hannah looked down at the boy in the water, and she saw something else. She saw her husband, burning with fever. She saw her tiny son, his breath growing shallow. She had watched them both die, helpless. She couldn't do it again. She couldn't just stand there and watch another life get snuffed out. Something inside her, a place that had been hollow and dead for 2 years, made a choice. With a strength she didn't know she had, she grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He was solid muscle and bone, a dead weight against the current. Her arms screamed, her lungs burned in the freezing air. Inch by painful inch, she dragged him out of the creek and onto the muddy grass. She couldn't take him to the cabin. Too risky. Someone might see. Her eyes darted around, desperate. And then she saw it. The root cellar. The slanted doors were built into a small hill 50 yards from her home. It was dark. It was damp. It was hidden. It would have to do. Getting him there almost broke her. She heaved and dragged and stumbled, his body a terrible burden. They collapsed together through the doors, tumbling into the earthy dark. She arranged him on a pile of old burlap sacks, his breathing a faint, rattling whisper in the sudden silence. She pulled the heavy doors shut, plunging them both into a blackness so complete it felt like being buried alive. And in that darkness, Hannah Weston knew with absolute certainty that she had just torched her own life. Everything was about to burn. For 3 days, Hannah lived 2 lives. By day, she was the quiet widow, tending her garden, her face a blank mask for anyone who might be watching. But by night, she was a ghost of a different kind, slipping through the darkness to the root cellar. She brought water, broth, and clean rags, moving like a shadow. The first time she lit a candle down there, The flickering light showed her the truth. The wound in his side was from a bullet. It was angry, red, and swollen. Her hands trembled as she opened her husband's old clasp knife. She sterilized the blade with whiskey, the smell sharp in the enclosed space. He groaned as she began to probe the wound. His eyes snapped open. They were dark, blazing with fever, but he didn't fight. He just watched her. His gaze was intense, intelligent, assessing her every move as she dug the lead ball out of his flesh. He watched as she cleaned the wound and packed it with a poultice of yarrow she'd gathered. They never spoke a word. In the close, damp darkness, words felt loud and clumsy. He was a presence, a heavy responsibility she had chosen. She learned the sound of his breathing, the slight tightening of his jaw when a wave of pain hit him. He learned her movements, the quiet efficiency of her hands, the deep, unshakable sadness in her eyes when she thought he was asleep. He was a warrior, trained to read people in a single glance, and in this strange, quiet woman, he saw no trickery, only a fierce, stubborn compassion that asked for nothing. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She came down the ladder to find him propped up on one elbow. His eyes were clear. The fever haze was gone. For the first time, he looked at her not as a threat or a savior, but as a person. "Water," he rasped. His voice was sandpaper. She held the dipper to his lips, and he drank, long and deep. He sank back down, his eyes closing for a moment. He looked at her, and the silence in the cellar suddenly felt heavy with a question. "Why?" he asked. The single word hung between them. Hannah looked at her own hands, stained with dirt and herbs and his blood. She thought of Arthur. She thought of Samuel. She thought of the cold, hard finality of the grave. "I know what it is to watch someone die," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I could not do it again." He didn't answer, but something shifted in his gaze. An understanding. In that dark, damp cellar, a bond was forged, not with words, but with a shared glance in the shadow of death. A silent promise made between two people who had nothing left to lose. Over the next week, he began to heal. He told her his name was Cha-Atan. He spoke English carefully, the way you'd handle a delicate tool. He'd learned it from traders. He never told her exactly how he got that bullet in his side, but he spoke of his people, the Lakota. He spoke of the land as if it were alive, a breathing thing that was a part of him. And Hannah, to her own surprise, started talking too. The words just came spilling out, words she had locked away for 2 long years. She told him about Arthur, who loved books more than farming. She told him about Samuel, who had his father's laugh. Sharing her grief with this stranger in the dark didn't fix it, but it made it lighter. It was like opening a window in a room that had been sealed shut. He got stronger every day. He would sit up, his back straight and covered in old scars, and watch her mend his torn buckskins. She was clumsy with the needle, but she was determined. One afternoon, he saw her shivering. Her shawl was thin, and the cellar's chill was deep in her bones. Without a word, he took one of the thick burlap sacks. With her knife, he cut and folded it with a surprising skill, fashioning it into a crude but warm wrap for her shoulders. It was a small thing, a simple gesture, but it hit Hannah like a physical blow. It was the first time anyone had shown her any real kindness, any real care, since Arthur died. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. He pretended not to see. The day finally came. She knew it was coming. He was strong enough to travel. The thought landed in her chest with the weight of a stone. The cellar, which had started as a prison, had somehow become a sanctuary. "I must go," he said one evening. His voice was steady, but his eyes were on her. "My people will think I have gone to the spirits." Hannah just nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. That night, under a sky with no moon, she opened the cellar doors. He climbed out, standing tall. The weakness was gone. He was filled with a quiet power that seemed to hum in the air around him. He looked at her small, weathered cabin. Then he looked at her. He placed his hand over his heart. It wasn't a salute. It was something deeper, a sign of profound respect. "You saved my life, Hannah Weston," he said, his voice low and serious. "My people do not forget a thing like this. A debt has been made." "There is no debt," she said too quickly. "Just be safe." He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. An entire lifetime seemed to pass between them in the darkness. Then he simply turned and melted into the night. He was as quiet as a shadow, gone as if he'd never been there at all. Hannah stood there listening, but the only thing left was the sound of the wind. And she had never, ever felt so alone. A week passed. The cellar was empty. The cabin was silent again. The loneliness that had been her constant companion came back with a vengeance. It was worse now, because for a short time, it had been gone. The beginning of the end came in the form of Martha Prescott. Martha was the town's self-appointed guardian of morality, a woman whose piety was matched only by her spectacular nosiness. She had always watched Hannah with suspicion, convinced that her quiet grief was a cover for some kind of sin. Martha had seen the light of Hannah's candle near the root cellar late one night. She'd convinced herself the widow was performing some kind of witchcraft. So she started snooping. She was pretending to gather berries near the creek, her eyes scanning Hannah's property, when she saw it. A small, dark strip of hide, caught on a thorn bush. It was stained with something dark, dried blood. It wasn't deer hide, it wasn't rabbit. Martha's eyes narrowed into tiny, gleeful slits. She knew. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. This was it. This was the proof she needed. She didn't walk to Sheriff Donovan's office. She ran. Sheriff Donovan was a man who liked simple problems. A drunk farmer, a stolen chicken. He preferred order over the messy business of actual justice. He listened to Martha's breathless, triumphant story, and his face settled into a grim mask. He'd always been wary of the Weston woman. Her husband had been a reader of books, a man who thought himself better than the rest of them. And Hannah, with her quiet dignity, had inherited that same unspoken arrogance in his eyes. The story clicked into place. The widow's isolation, the rumors of Lakota bands being pushed south, Martha's scrap of bloody hide. He gathered 2 deputies, their faces nervous. They rode out to Hannah's cabin. They found her chopping wood, the steady thwack of the axe the only sound in the cold, clear air. She saw them coming, but she didn't stop. She finished the log she was splitting, then rested the axe head on the block and waited. Her calm unnerved them more than any outburst would have. "Hannah Weston," the sheriff said, his voice flat and hard. He held up the bloody piece of hide. "Martha Prescott found this by the creek, on your property line." Hannah's face was stone. She gave nothing away. "The creek washes up all sorts of things, Sheriff." His eyes weren't on her. They were sweeping her property. They scanned the cabin, the woodpile, the small garden, and then they landed on the slanted doors of the root cellar. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "I think I'll have a look in there," he said, swinging down from his horse. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, shot through Hannah's gut. But on the outside, she was still, a statue carved from granite. She stood her ground as the deputies, eager and rough, wrenched the heavy doors open. It didn't take them long. The packed-down burlap sacks, a faint, lingering smell of sickness and herbs, and on the dark, damp earth of the cellar floor, a single overlooked drop of blood. It might as well have been a signed confession. The sheriff climbed out of the darkness, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. He looked at Hannah, his eyes filled with a mixture of disgust and triumph. "You harbored one of them." He spat the words like poison. "A heathen savage, right here, right under our noses." The accusation was also the sentence, and Hannah knew, as they grabbed her arms, that her life in Providence Creek was over. The news hit Providence Creek like a lit match on dry grass. By the time Sheriff Donovan dragged Hannah into the center of town, a crowd was already there. They swarmed out of the general store, the blacksmith shop, the saloon. Their faces were a terrifying gallery of fear and rage. In their eyes, she wasn't Hannah Weston anymore. She was a traitor, the enemy within, the woman who had chosen a savage over her own kind. Reverend Blackwood stood on the steps of his church, waiting. He looked like an Old Testament prophet, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with a holy fire. "This woman!" he boomed, his voice rolling over the silent, angry crowd. "She has brought a viper into our home. She has betrayed her people. She has betrayed her God, and she has betrayed the memory of her good Christian husband." He pointed a trembling finger at Hannah. "She offered comfort to the wolf that would slaughter our lambs." They didn't bother with the courthouse. They held the trial right there in the church. It wasn't a trial, it was a ritual, a foregone conclusion. Hannah stood before them, her chin held high. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't try to explain the simple human reason for what she'd done. How could she explain a flicker of compassion to a room full of blind hatred? Her silence infuriated them. To them, it was arrogance. It was proof of her guilt. They weren't going to hang her. Hanging was too quick, too merciful. Reverend Blackwood, in his infinite and cruel wisdom, devised a punishment that was meant to be a lesson, a slow, public spectacle of suffering. "She will be locked in the stocks," he declared, his eyes gleaming. "In the center of the town square, without food, without water. She chose to feed the savage, so let her know what it is to starve among her own people. We will let God's own judgment pass upon her." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. They dragged her to the square. The stocks were old and hadn't been used in years. The wood was gray, splintered, and menacing. They forced her head and wrists through the holes, the rough wood scraping her skin raw. Then the heavy top beam slammed down, and the iron pin was driven home. She was trapped, a public display of sin. The crowd watched, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and uneasy fear. No one spoke up. No one dared. The weight of the town's judgment settled on Hannah's shoulders, heavier and more crushing than the splintered wood that bound her. The first day was a battle of wills. She held her head high, meeting the hateful stares of the townspeople. She ignored the taunts. She ignored the pebbles the children threw, which stung her cheeks like angry wasps. The sun was relentless, a hot hammer beating down on her head. Thirst started as a tickle in her throat. By nightfall, the cold seeped into her bones. Her muscles, locked in the unnatural position, screamed in agony. Sleep was impossible. The second day, her world shrank to a blurry circle of pain. The town square swam in and out of focus. The thirst was no longer a tickle. It was a fire, a raging inferno in her throat and stomach. Her lips cracked and bled. The faces of the people who walked by were distorted masks of contempt. She saw Martha Prescott walk past, a smug, satisfied smile on her face. In her delirium, she thought of Chayatan. She prayed he was safe, far away from this place. The memory of his quiet strength in the cellar was a small, cool stone she held in the furnace of her pain. Then she thought of Arthur and Samuel, and a wave of pure, black despair washed over her. She was going to die here, alone, disgraced. Her body left to rot as a warning to others. By the morning of the third day, she was barely there. Her head hung low, her matted hair hiding her face. The world was a shimmering haze of light and agony. She heard a humming sound, a low buzzing. She thought it was in her own head, the sound of her life fading out. But the sound grew louder. It wasn't a buzzing. It was a rumble. A low, rhythmic thunder that seemed to come from the very earth itself. But the sky was clear and blue. Heads started to turn. The morning bustle of Providence Creek faltered. A shopkeeper froze with his hand on a barrel of nails. A woman dropped her basket of laundry. Faces turned from Hannah, their expressions shifting from contempt to confusion, then to fear. The sound grew louder. It was the sound of 100 drums beating as one. It was the sound of a storm coming, but not from the sky. And then they saw them. They came over the rise to the west, a long, dark river of riders flowing silently across the plains. They weren't painted for war. There were no whoops, no hollers, just a terrifying, disciplined silence. They just kept coming. Not 20, not 50, 200 of them. 200 Lakota warriors on horseback, armed with rifles and bows, their faces like stone. They flowed into the flatlands before the town and stopped, a silent, unmovable wall of power. At their head, on a proud war horse, sat Cha'atan. He was not the wounded man from her cellar. He sat on his horse with the easy authority of a king. He was a leader, a chief. He was power itself. A wave of pure, primal terror washed through Providence Creek. This was their nightmare come to life. Sheriff Donovan and his 2 deputies stood frozen in front of the jail, their hands hovering uselessly near their guns. They were 3 men against 200. Reverend Blackwood's face, which had been flushed with righteousness, was now the color of ash. His certainty, his power, his God. It all evaporated in the face of this silent, overwhelming force. The column of riders halted at the edge of the town. The silence was absolute. Suffocating. Cha'atan dismounted. He walked forward alone, his footsteps the only sound in the world. He didn't look at the sheriff. He didn't look at the preacher. He didn't look at the terrified faces of the crowd. His eyes were fixed on one thing, the broken, slumped figure in the stocks. He walked straight to Hannah. His face was unreadable, a mask of grim purpose. He knelt before her in the dust, ignoring the filth and the stench of her suffering. From a pouch at his belt, he took a water skin. Gently, so gently, he lifted her heavy head. He pressed the mouth of the skin to her cracked, bleeding lips. The water was cool. It was life. It was a miracle. She choked and sputtered, but she drank. It was a shock to her system, a jolt of pure life running through her dying body. Then, from the same pouch, he took a small cloth parcel. Inside was dried meat and a piece of flat, hearty bread. He broke off a tiny piece of the bread, as small as a child's portion, and gently placed it in her mouth. He waited patiently for her to find the strength to chew and swallow. Then he gave her another. He fed her. Right there. In the center of the town that had condemned her to starve. It was an act of such deliberate, tender care that it was more powerful, more terrifying than any threat of violence. Reverend Blackwood finally found his voice. It was shrill, thin, and laced with panic. "What is the meaning of this? This is a place of Christian justice. You have no right." Cha'atan rose slowly to his full height. He turned to face the preacher, and a cold fire burned in his dark eyes. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a shard of ice. "Justice," he said, and the word itself sounded like a weapon. "You speak to me of justice." He gestured to Hannah, still slumped and broken. "This woman found me in a ditch, dying. She did not see a Lakota. She saw a man. She showed me mercy when you would have shown me a rope. She gave me life." His gaze swept over the petrified crowd, lingering for a long, cold moment on the sheriff and then on the preacher. "Her kindness is a debt my people honor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "So now, we will show you our justice." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. They expected a slaughter. Sheriff Donovan's hand tightened on the butt of his pistol, a completely futile gesture. But Cha'atan didn't call for an attack. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply raised one hand. At the signal, 2 of his warriors stepped forward. They carried heavy axes. They walked to the stocks, ignoring the terrified townspeople. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. 2 swift, powerful blows. The thick wooden beams of the stocks shattered like kindling. Hannah slumped forward, unconscious. Before she could hit the ground, Cha'atan was there. He caught her, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Her body was frail, a bird with broken wings. He held her and turned to face the town one last time. "Her home," Cha'atan announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority that no one dared question, "is now under the protection of the Lakota. You will not go near it. You will not harm her animals. You will not speak her name with anything but respect." His eyes narrowed, promising a terrible retribution. "If a single stone from her chimney is dislodged, we will know. We will always be watching." He turned and carried Hannah away from the square. His warriors parted silently to let him pass, their faces grim and unmoving. As he walked, he gave another quiet order. A group of 20 warriors broke from the main force. They moved with a silent, terrifying purpose toward Hannah's small cabin on the edge of town. They didn't ride. They walked, forming a loose, impenetrable ring around her property. They didn't build fires. They didn't make a sound. They just stood there, sentinels of a new and absolute power. A living wall between Hannah and the town that had betrayed her. The remaining 180 warriors didn't leave. They stayed right where they were, a silent, unmoving army holding the entire town of Providence Creek hostage, with nothing more than their presence. The message was clear. The old rules were dead. Back in her own bed, the scent of wood smoke and dried lavender filled Hannah's senses. It was the smell of home, a stark contrast to the filth of the town square. Cha'atan laid her down gently. An older Lakota man, a healer with kind, knowing eyes, came in with herbs and water. He began to clean her wounds, tending to her raw wrists and the sores on her body with practiced hands. For the first time in 2 years, the silence in Hannah's cabin wasn't empty. It was full. It was a quiet, protective presence that wrapped around her like a blanket. Cha'atan stayed. The large force of warriors left the next day, their point having been made in terrifying fashion. But the 20 guards remained. They set up a small, discreet camp by the creek, their watch constant and unbroken. Cha'atan himself didn't stay in her house. He moved into her barn, a respectful distance that was also a constant reassurance. Every time she looked out her window, she saw one of the silent sentinels, a reminder that she was no longer alone. Providence Creek was a town transformed. The arrogance was gone, shattered by fear. The people left Hannah completely alone. When they saw her, they averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of terror and a new, grudging respect. The power of Reverend Blackwood and Sheriff Donovan had been exposed for what it was, a fragile shell, easily broken. In the weeks that followed, Hannah healed. Her body regained its strength, but the real transformation was in her spirit. The gnawing loneliness that had been eating her alive for years was gone, replaced by a sense of safety she had never known. She and Cha'atan found a new rhythm. He helped with her chores, his quiet strength making light work of the tasks that had always strained her. He repaired her fence. He reinforced the roof of the barn. He hunted, and they shared the fresh meat. He was a constant, steady presence. In the evenings, they would sit by her small fire. He told her stories of his people, of the stars they saw as ancestors, of the changing seasons. He spoke of a world filled with spirit and meaning, a world so different from the rigid, fearful faith of Providence Creek. In return, she began to read to him from Arthur's old books. At first, her voice was hesitant, rusty from disuse, but with each passing night, it grew stronger, clearer. She discovered that beneath his warrior's exterior was a sharp, curious mind, and a gentleness she had only glimpsed in the darkness of the cellar. He saw in her a strength that humbled him, a spirit as tough and as beautiful as a wildflower that finds a way to grow in solid rock. They were two broken people from two different worlds who were slowly, quietly healing each other. One evening, a light snow began to fall, blanketing the harsh landscape in a soft, forgiving white. The world outside was hushed. He looked at her across the warm glow of the hearth. "The debt is paid," he said quietly. "My men can leave now. I can leave. The town will not trouble you again." Hannah looked around the small, warm cabin. For 2 years, this place had been nothing but a container for her grief. A shell. Now it felt like a home again. The thought of it falling silent, of his steady presence disappearing from her life. It was an ache she couldn't bear. Her voice was soft, but it didn't tremble. "Is it your wish to go?" He held her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers, seeing past the widow, past the survivor, to the woman she was becoming. "My people are my life," he said, his voice low and serious. "But a man can have more than one home. Here. With you. I have found a place of peace I did not know I was looking for." A smile touched Hannah's lips. It was the first real smile she'd had in a very long time. It felt like the sun rising inside her chest. Outside, the wind howled across the plains. But for the first time, it didn't sound like a ghost. It didn't sound lonely. It sounded like the world turning, moving forward, carrying them both toward a future neither of them could ever have imagined. In the heart of an unforgiving land, a hunted warrior and a forgotten widow had built something new from the ashes of their old lives. A sanctuary. A home. Guarded not by fear or by force, but by the quiet, unshakable power of a single act of kindness. If you enjoyed this story and believe that one small act of compassion can change the world, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden histories we'll uncover together.